have a PlayStation. It's a PlayStation.
It's Xbox.
PlayStation.
It's hard to picture a time when the biggest video game console rivalry wasn't between PlayStation and Xbox. But 30 years ago, most gamers were split between Nintendo and Sega. In 1985, Nintendo did the unthinkable by successfully reviving the video game industry in America after the market crashed years earlier. Nintendo did this by introducing the Nintendo Entertainment System and a video game about an Italian plumber named Mario. Other exclusives for the NES, like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, helped secure Nintendo's position as the biggest name in gaming at the time. Their market share of the video game industry was estimated to be 90% in 1987, according to IGN. After Nintendo breathed life into the video game industry, Sega looked to unseat them with a new console of their own, a redesigned version of their Mark III console dubbed the Master System, which hit the US market in 1986. While faring better in some other markets, the Master System did not have the impact that Sega wanted in the US. Lagging sales coupled with a lack of third-party support for popular games sealed the Master System's fate. Despite Sega losing their 8-bit console battle with Nintendo, they would bounce back with their 16-bit console. Sega had been making 16-bit arcade games for years, and used that arcade experience to create a new, more powerful console called the Mega Drive in 1988. Sega's headstrong CEO, Hayao Nakayama, and co-founder David Rosen wanted their new console to make waves in the US, so they hired Michael Katz as the CEO of Sega of America and rebranded the Mega Drive for the American market as the Sega Genesis. The Genesis hit the US market in 1989 and was aggressively marketed under Katz's instruction. Sega of America launched an ad campaign targeting Nintendo with the tagline, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," and paid celebrities like Joe Montana and Michael Jackson to promote the console. The Genesis did well in terms of sales in the US its first year, but it wasn't enough for Nakayama. Katz was removed as CEO of Sega of America and replaced with former Mattel CEO Tom Kalinske in 1990. Sega also knew they needed a Mario rivaling mascot, and in 1991 they delivered one with Sonic the Hedgehog. Kalinske went to work boosting the Genesis's market share in America by cutting the price of the Genesis and bundling Sonic with the console.
Yeah, well, after I joined, one of the other things I lowered the price of hardware too. That helped from $200 to $149. And the title that was packed in with the Genesis hardware at the time was Altered Beast. Well, in Kansas and Oklahoma and the Midwest, a lot of people thought Altered Beast was devil worship, and they just didn't like the title. They didn't like the name. And so I was asking around inside both the US R&D and Japan R&D, well, come on, we need a better game. We need something that appeals to all ages, all boys and girls, men and women. We need our own mascot to go up against Mario. What do we got working? And there weren't many ideas, frankly. And there were like 2 ideas that were sort of okay. And one of those was Sonic the Hedgehog.
Kalinske's strategy worked. New Genesis consoles bundled with copies of Sonic the Hedgehog hit the market in the summer of '91, several months ahead of Nintendo's 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and at a lower cost.
We actually passed Nintendo in total sales and share of market by 1993. And and I'm talking about total share of market, so that we didn't have hardly any 8-bit business. I mean, I didn't really care about it, but it was almost all 16-bit Genesis. And then also the handheld device, Game Gear, ended up outselling Game Boy for a while. So by 93, according to, and this is my numbers, I'm not making them up, this is from the NPD data, and Nielsen data showed that we passed Nintendo in 1993.
Sega's success in the early 90s with the Genesis would eventually unravel with Sega's follow-up console, the Saturn.
I wasn't a fan of the Saturn architecture. And the reason was I depended on my head of R&D, a guy named Joe Miller. And he felt that it wasn't good enough. So Joe Miller and I went down the highway to Silicon Graphics headquarters here in Northern California and looked at this chipset.
Kalinsky pleaded with Sega of Japan to get the Saturn's hardware changed, but Sega of Japan disagreed.
Because in the United States, our responsibility was not hardware at all. That was supposed to be done in Japan. We were supposed to do great software, great games. And so we called Japan and said, you got to send the hardware team over here to look at this because we think it's really special. Well, they came over and they looked at it and they said, yeah, it's good. It does some things that our chips don't do. Graphics are wonderful. But in manufacturing, when they cut the wafers off the big disk, there's going to be too much waste. And that's going to cause cost issues. So we don't think we can do it. We don't want to do it. So they turned it down. And later, Jim Clark and Jensen Wang called me up and said, well, what should we do now? And I said, well, there's this other company in in Washington, Seattle. You might want to go talk to them. And of course, that's how that chipset then became part of Nintendo 64.
The Saturn remained unchanged, and at the 1995 Electronic Entertainment Expo, Kalinsky revealed the Saturn to the US market with a sticker price of $399. At the same expo, Sony unveiled their highly anticipated entry into the video game console market, the PlayStation. Sony's head of development, Steve Race, took to the stage and only said 3 words, $299, before walking off to thunderous applause. Kalinsky left Sega in 1996, 3 years before Sega would release their final console, the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast sold well upon its initial release, but its lifespan would be short-lived. Sega was losing money and wanted to shift their focus from video game hardware to solely software. The Dreamcast also faced steep competition from the PlayStation 2, and in 2001, Sega pulled the plug. Sega still continues to make games, but they lost the console war.